The mid-14th century found a bustling Europe, shaped by centuries of agricultural expansion, revitalized trade routes, and an increasingly dense urban web. Under the gray autumn skies of 1347, the waters of the Mediterranean Sea carried not only the riches of the East, but also the herald of an implacable and invisible transformation. When the Genoese galleys docked in the busy port of Messina, Sicily, the men crowding the docks expected the unloading of fine fabrics, rare spices, and precious grains. Instead, they were met with a spectacle of silent horror. Entire crews lay dying on the decks, their bodies marked by dark pustules and overwhelming fevers. These ghost ships brought with them a microscopic passenger, an elemental force that would rewrite the destiny of the continent and demonstrate the fragility of human structures in the face of the planet's biological whims. In the following weeks, panic spread faster than the sea waters themselves could run, echoing through the narrow, damp alleys of Sicily before casting itself, like a dense and inevitable mist, over the rest of the Italian peninsula and the kingdoms beyond the Alps. To understand the magnitude of the approaching cataclysm, one must look at the complex ecological web of the time, where the proximity between humanity and the animal world was absolute and devoid of modern notions of hygiene. The true engine of devastation lay not in invading armies or large, visible climate catastrophes, but rather in the deadly symbiosis between a bacterium, a flea, and a rodent. The black rat, an omnipresent inhabitant of medieval cities, found the perfect environment for its unchecked proliferation in overcrowded granaries, open sewers, and the crevices of wood and thatched dwellings. Beneath the dense fur of these animals hid the rat flea, a tiny parasite whose digestive tract had become a biological battlefield. The bacterium known today as Yersinia pestis multiplied in the insect's stomach, creating a solid blockage that prevented any food from passing through. Famished and desperate due to the obstruction, the flea began frantically biting any warm-blooded host it encountered, regurgitating the bacterial load directly into the victim's bloodstream before seeking its next target. When the rat population began to succumb en masse to the infection itself, the parasites abandoned the cold corpses of their original hosts and turned to humans, who lived huddled together in the dark dwellings of the medieval winter. The speed with which the disease took root in urban communities transformed the daily rhythm of Europe's most prosperous cities into a nightmare of isolation and silence. Places that once pulsed with the cries of merchants, the clinking of craftsmen's tools, and the clamor of taverns were suddenly plunged into a sepulchral stillness. The city air, already naturally heavy due to the absence of basic sanitation, became unbreathable, impregnated with the odor of decomposition and the smoke of fires lit on street corners in a desperate attempt to purify the atmosphere. The windows of houses were locked from the inside, and doors were marked with crosses or warning signs, isolating entire families from the rest of the world. The circulation of goods ceased almost completely. Ports closed their barriers, once busy roads became dangerous and deserted paths, and the agricultural fields surrounding urban walls began to be abandoned to their fate. The routine of waking up, working, and interacting was replaced by a constant vigil, where each individual observed their own body and that of family members in search of the slightest sign of weakness, a line of fever, or the dreaded swelling in the lymph nodes. The physical manifestation of the plague was a visual and tactile testament to the suffering that plagued the population without distinction of class, age, or wealth. The process began subtly with a sudden chill, excruciating pain in the joints, and a deep exhaustion that prostrated even the most robust bodies within a few hours. Next, the lymphatic system became the main stage of aggression. Painful nodules, dubbed buboes due to their rounded shape, appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck, expanding until they reached the size of apples or goose eggs. These swellings acquired a purplish or black coloration, indicating the internal hemorrhage occurring beneath the skin. For observers of the time, the sight of those deformed bodies was the materialization of the darkest punishments described in sacred texts. The heat of the high, delirious fever caused the sick to lose track of time and space, emitting groans that echoed through the thin walls of medieval dwellings. In the final stages, when the infection reached the lungs in its pneumonic form, the suffering was crowned by an incessant cough that expelled dark blood, spreading the bacteria through the air via saliva droplets and ensuring that the cycle of contagion restarted in an even more lethal and direct way among those who tried to offer some comfort. Faced with such an overwhelming and incomprehensible destructive force, the foundations of morality and the social relations that sustained medieval civilization began to crumble with alarming speed. The fear of contagion outweighed the deepest feelings of affection, duty, and human solidarity. Chronic accounts of the time describe with awe how the community fabric unraveled in a few months. Husbands abandoned their dying wives in alcoves, brothers locked their doors to protect themselves from their own blood relatives, and, in the ultimate limit of despair, parents left behind their febrile children, fleeing to the countryside under the illusion that geographical distance could save them from the invisible scythe. Community ties that united villages and parishes disappeared, replaced by a generalized mutual distrust, where every human being was seen as a potential vector of death. The clergy, whose role was to offer supreme spiritual comfort and the last sacraments to the dying, often refused to enter infected houses, fearing for their own lives, leaving thousands of souls to depart this world without the passing rituals they considered indispensable for eternal salvation. This loneliness at the moment of death deepened the psychological trauma of a generation that felt abandoned by both men and the divine. The massive accumulation of corpses presented an unprecedented logistical and sanitary challenge, completely subverting the funerary traditions that were the pillar of medieval Christian culture. Parish cemeteries, sacred and limited spaces situated at the heart of communities, reached maximum capacity within a few weeks, forcing authorities to take extreme measures that were profane in the eyes of the population. Large trenches and common graves were dug outside city walls or in vacant lots, where hundreds of bodies were piled in layers, separated only by a thin covering of lime and earth, as if they were goods in an overcrowded warehouse. The ritualistic respect that once surrounded an individual's passing disappeared. There were no more funeral processions, the bells were no longer heard tolling for the dead, their constant tolling having become an unbearable reminder of the imminent end, and prayers were replaced by the creaking of cart wheels circulating during the deep hours of the night. Men of low social standing, often released prisoners or individuals driven desperate by absolute misery, were hired at exorbitant prices to collect bodies from sidewalks and inside abandoned residences, operating with a blind indifference that reflected the emotional numbing of the entire society. 14th century medicine, grounded in the classical teachings of antiquity and the theory of the four bodily humors, found itself completely disarmed and blind to the speed and virulence of the Black Death. Without knowledge of the existence of microorganisms or mechanisms of vector transmission, the most prestigious physicians at the universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford attributed the disaster to macrocosmic causes, such as unfavorable planetary conjunctions between Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, or the corruption of the air through so-called miasmas. It was believed that poisonous emanations coming from the interior of the Earth, stagnant swamps, or distant earthquakes traveled with the winds, penetrating the human body through the pores of the skin. To combat this invisible and atmospheric enemy, medical recommendations were based on altering the sensory environment. People were instructed to burn aromatic woods like pine and laurel, to carry bouquets of flowers and fragrant herbs to cover their noses in the streets, and to avoid hot baths, as it was thought that opening the pores would facilitate the entry of corrupted air. The treatments applied to the sick were ineffective and frequently accelerated death, consisting of violent bloodlettings that drained the patient's strength, absurdly restrictive diets, and the application of exotic or repulsive substances onto the buboes, such as poultices of human feces mixed with plant resins in the hope of drawing out the poison. As earthly solutions failed and mortality continued its upward trajectory, the search for answers migrated definitively into the realm of the supernatural and religious fanaticism, transforming the cultural landscape of Europe into a stage of extreme penance and persecution. The widespread conviction that the plague was the physical manifestation of divine wrath against the sins of humanity gave rise to radical movements of devotion that crossed kingdom borders. Groups of flagellants, processions of hundreds of barefooted and hooded men and women, marched from village to village chanting melancholy hymns and whipping their own backs with leather scourges punctuated by metal tips. In public squares, before terrified crowds, they staged their own suffering as a necessary sacrifice to appease celestial justice, transforming physical pain into a spectacle of collective redemption. However, this same religious fever frequently boiled over into violence directed against minorities and the marginalized of medieval society. In a desperate search for scapegoats to explain the contamination of water and air, entire Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning public wells, resulting in brutal massacres and the destruction of historic neighborhoods in cities along the Rhine River and Central Europe. While the cities concentrated the most dramatic and visible episodes of the collapse, the rural world, where the overwhelming majority of the European population resided, underwent a slower but equally profound and lasting transformation in its ecological and economic structures. The advance of the plague through the countryside interrupted the ancestral cycle of agriculture that had governed peasant life since time immemorial. With entire villages deserted due to mortality or mass flight, vast expanses of arable land, which had been conquered from the forests through centuries of arduous clearing, were suddenly abandoned to oblivion. Herds of sheep and cattle, without shepherds to guide or protect them, scattered across plains and hills, becoming easy prey for wolves, whose populations experienced significant and bold growth, approaching vacant human dwellings. Crops of wheat, barley, and rye rotted on their stalks without hands to harvest them, provoking a subsequent crisis of food scarcity that prolonged the suffering of the survivors through widespread hunger. Wild nature began to reclaim the space that had been taken from it, covering paths with overgrown vegetation and silencing the valleys that once echoed with the constant toil of the land. Ironically, the demographic vacuum left by the biological catastrophe triggered a profound upheaval in the economic and contractual relationships that defined the feudal system, permanently altering the balance of power between landowners and the surviving working class. With the drastic scarcity of agricultural and artisanal labor, the value of human work rose to heights never before seen in the history of the continent. The peasants who managed to resist the infection realized that their workforce had turned into a precious and contested resource. They began to refuse old servile obligations and to demand high cash wages, as well as the freedom to migrate to lands that offered the best contractual conditions. Landowners, faced with the ruin of their incomes if they left the fields idle, found themselves forced to yield to the workers' demands, granting franchises, reducing taxes, and, in many cases, allowing the purchase of freedom from legal servitude. This process of economic emancipation weakened the foundations of traditional feudalism, accelerating the development of an economy based on the monetary market and opening space for greater social mobility that would shape Europe's transition to modernity in the following decades. The constant and inevitable proximity to human finitude deeply reconfigured the collective psychology, artistic expression, and cultural sensitivity of the generation that survived the years of terror of the Black Death. Artistic aesthetics, which had previously focused on hieratic, celestial, and triumphant representations of divinity, became dominated by a graphic obsession with the decomposition of the body and the inevitability of death. The iconographic themes of the Dance of Death and the Triumph of Death emerged, manifested in frescoes on church walls, manuscript illuminations, and detailed tomb sculptures. In these representations, grinning skeletons and corpses in advanced stages of putrefaction were depicted leading popes, emperors, cardinals, nobles, merchants, and peasants in the same circular and frantic dance toward the grave. The underlying message of this artistic current was clear and democratic. In the face of death, all earthly distinctions of power, wealth, lineage, and wisdom were absolutely null and devoid of meaning. This awareness of impermanence also generated a behavioral divide in society. While some surrendered to a melancholy and ascetic mysticism, others adopted a desperate hedonism, spending their resources on parties and excesses under the premise that tomorrow was an empty promise. The Europe that emerged from the ashes of the Black Death around 1351 was a deeply transformed continent, marked by scars visible on the landscape and invisible in the souls of its inhabitants, but it carried within it the seeds of a profound and unexpected renewal. The loss of tens of millions of human lives forced society to seek new forms of technical efficiency, driving innovations in agricultural management, maritime navigation, and nascent industrial processes to compensate for the lack of hands. In the field of knowledge, the evident failure of old medical and theological certainties opened the first cracks in scholastic dogmatism, encouraging a more empirical observation of nature and the human body, which would pave the way for the future development of modern science and public health, including the creation of the first formal quarantine systems in the ports of the Adriatic. The ecological balance of the planet demonstrated its implacable capacity for self-regulation, reminding humanity that, despite its imperial constructions, its complex laws, and its civilizational arrogance, it remains intrinsically connected and subordinate to the hidden biological laws that govern the Earth's biosphere. The great cycle of life and death continued its course, proving that even after the darkest and most devastating night, the Earth finds ways to regenerate, redraw its landscapes, and begin a new chapter of its continuous history.